Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we're talking about yeast starters. So what is a yeast starter? A yeast starter is a solution that helps yeast reproduce. So now, why would you make a yeast starter? I know that some do it, some don't. So why would you do it? Just like humans, when yeast have too much work to do, they get stressed. And when you have a yeast starter, you give the yeast the chance to reproduce their cells. So each yeast has less sugar to ferment. In the end, they have less work to do when there's a yeast starter because there's more of them available to do fermentation. And this results in better quality of alcohol. So how do you make a yeast starter? What I do, I take my wash, so that's water, sugar, molasses, and I put it in a little container. And I put in 1 tablespoon of yeast and I let it sit there. Although I must admit that I've usually let it sit there for only 5 to 10 minutes, but it's suggested as a yeast starter to leave it there for 24 to 48 hours. And there are other alternatives. So instead of putting your wash, you can always put warm water and then pitch the yeast in the warm water. As long as the yeast is in contact with liquid, it can start reproducing. And how does it reproduce? It's done so with aerobic respiration, and this means that the oxygen is in contact with the yeast. Therefore, fermentation is kept to a minimum while yeast cells multiply. Once the yeast starter is complete after the 24 to 48 hours, it's best to pitch the yeast inside the jar at peak activity. So this is when yeast cells have increased in number and they're still active. So you can pitch it while it's at its optimal activity or just right after. By pitching it then, and make sure that fermentation is healthy and that it doesn't take a long time before it begins. When I do my fermentation, my past batches actually, I put my yeast in the jar and it takes up to 24 hours to start the fermentation or for me to notice bubbling inside the jar. So instead of putting it in the jar right away, this is where the yeast starter comes in. Instead of the bubbles going inside the jar right away, you make the bubbles start in the yeast starter in the side dish, and then you put the yeast when it's already active inside the jar. But now, how much yeast are we talking about? So I talked about 1 teaspoon of yeast earlier, and usually 1 pack of yeast ferments beer with a starting gravity of 1.04 roughly to 1.06. Therefore, if you make your wash really sweet, or if your starting gravity is above that number, or if you live in a cold temperature, you might need more yeast so the yeast becomes active and it's able to ferment. By the way, yeast starters also help prevent off flavors. And an important note that when you're putting yeast inside the jar, it's always good to have enough water because water helps yeast be happy. It's part of the environment. Now, for the basic guidelines of a yeast starter, many yeast packages are designed for 5-gallon alcohol washes of beer making at a starting gravity of less than 0.6. And more specifically, I mentioned temperature earlier, but the packages are made for fermentation between 18 to 22 degrees Celsius or 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. You might need to adjust your amount of yeast depending on if you live in the warmer temperature, colder temperature, if you added more sugar or less sugar into your wash or your mash. And now I'm just going to give you a little tips on the yeast starters. Periodically adding CO2 or oxygen to the yeast cells helps yeast cells improve. So they get more healthy, they get more strong. And when you occasionally stir the yeast starter, this helps as well by increasing the number of yeast cells. When yeast cells are shaken, this produces up to 25 to 50% more yeast cells compared to yeast that is not touched at all. And for those that are making huge batches of beer, of wine, of mead, you might need 2 starters, and this is called a 2-stage propagation. And how this works is that once you put your yeast starter into a dish and you stir it a little bit, after 24 to 36 hours, you put it inside the jar that you're fermenting, and you wait for that jar to finish fermentation. You wait up to a couple of weeks. And once it's ready, once the fermentation process is done, you put it in the fridge so it can clear out the top part of the jar, and you repeat. So with this newly fermented alcohol, you put in another yeast starter into the jar to help ferment it into more alcohol. However, it's an important note to sanitize all your equipment because as yeast starters increase yeast cells, infections can also increase and multiply, and small contaminants can develop up to the amount where it's no longer beneficial for alcohol. So drop a comment below if you've done yeast starters and if ever you've had an infection or contaminants enter your jar. I'm curious to know because when we're talking about open fermentation and yeast starters, there's a lot of particles in the air. that might not necessarily be sanitary. I made a short video on disinfecting and it went terribly wrong, so if you'd like to check it out and avoid the mistakes that I've made, you can click on the video right here. If you found this video valuable, don't forget to share it with a friend, like and subscribe. See you in the next one.